All right. Looks like our numbers have stabilized here, so we will get started. Thank you all for being here. We are back once again for our 9th installment of our rulemaking meeting series. I'm Ariel Finney, the Walkers Fund Policy and Rules Manager, and I'm joined today by Vicki Bouvier, our Walkers Fund Workforce Policy Manager. We're part of the Department of Social and Health Services Washington Cares Fund team working on rulemaking for a new chapter of Washington Administrative Code. Each meeting we're focusing on specific topics related to rulemaking, and today we will be focusing on provider registration, specifically regarding denial or discontinuation. If you weren't able to join us last time, we did dive into more discussion points around provider registration. We do have a recording of that you're welcome to go back and review and provide comments. Otherwise, today we're going to be focusing mainly on that registration denial and discontinuation element. At least that's where our discussion will be focused today. As a reminder, we will only be addressing rulemaking for the Department of Social and Health Services. Employment Security Department is also doing rulemaking, so please reach out to Employment Security Department if you are interested in their rulemaking activities. Some housekeeping before we begin, or our agenda, I should say. Our agenda includes some housekeeping. For those who've joined us before, this is a very kind of standard format that we've been following, where we introduce some common terms, we go over a brief presentation, and then we enter our discussion. The main point of these meetings is really that discussion element. These are really designed to be listening sessions, to be hearing from you all, hearing the expertise of our community members and interested parties to be able to inform our drafts as we do rulemaking. So please stick around for that discussion part, and please feel free to engage as much as you would like to. We're really here to be listening to you and hearing what you have to say about the questions we have drafted. We are scheduled for 2 hours today, but we are very consistently wrapping up about 1 hour. So I won't guarantee that today. It all depends on discussion, but I do expect we will end earlier than the 2-hour mark. So let's go over some housekeeping. So for those who are joining us for the first time, you're kind of oriented to how we operate here. We have the Q&A feature available for questions throughout the presentation today. We will do our best to address those questions as we go, but please be patient if your question isn't answered right away. We're doing our best to capture that, but also may need to do some research and get back to you as well. The chat will be disabled during the presentation, but we will open it for the discussion part of our session today. So that will be after we do the brief presentation, we'll have discussion and the chat will be available for that. We are recording the webinar and the slide deck and the recording will be available on our website. We try to have that uploaded by the end of the week. Sometimes we have had some technical delays here, but for the most part, we're doing pretty good at getting it up by the end of the week. So if you want to rewatch this, or if you know you have peers or other people who may be interested, please know that this one, as well as the other ones that we've done so far, are all available on the website up on your screen. And if you do have comments that you want to provide regarding any of the topics we've covered so far, you are welcome to do that. So please feel free, if it's something from past sessions, we're still accepting comments on that. So feel free to send those over to me. Our next meeting is going to be on July 17th at 2 p.m. This will be our final wrap-up. We scheduled that one mainly as an opportunity to finish any discussions that needed more time. We've done very well on time, so it should be geared mostly around our governance structure that we plan for rulemaking and kind of opening it up for any final questions. We do expect that we'll probably have some more of these along the way as we do more rulemaking, but for now, this is I think covering the areas that we are drafting at this time. So our purpose today is to hear ideas from you all about rulemaking. As I said, that's really the heart and soul of this whole time here together. We are working on our initial drafts of rules, and hearing from you all really goes directly into our drafts. You know, hearing what is valuable, things that we need to be considering, There may be times when we look at the information and we decide that's not the way we're going to go, but that is part of our discussion. So please know that the comments and feedback we're hearing today regarding rulemaking really ties into that discussion. We're not going to be addressing any program questions. We have a whole team of customer care team is ready to answer those questions for you at the email up on the screen, which is wacars@dshs.wa.gov. And they'll be happy to answer any program type questions that you have. Today, we're going to be focusing on rulemaking, though. So happy to answer questions about rulemaking wherever we have answers. So I'm going to go over a few common terms. If you've joined us before, you're probably already quite familiar with these, but if you're joining us for the first time, I want to make sure that you have the foundation for the language that we're going to use. For the most part, these terms have been coming up in each of our sessions, and I want to make sure you are familiar with them. So to start off with, the Department of Social and Health Services is the lead in the Washington Cares Fund project. This meeting series is focused on the work being done by the Department of Social and Health Services. You will commonly hear the Department of Social and Health Services referred to as DSHS. Employment Security Department also has a major role in this project. Employment Security Department is leading the work on employee contributions. You'll commonly hear the Employment Security Department referred to as ESD. The Healthcare Authority is the third department responsible for a major part of the Washington Cares Fund program. They're responsible for the payment system, verifying use of benefits, and establishing criteria for payment and benefits to providers. You'll commonly hear the Healthcare Authority referred to as HCA. Long-term services and supports, or LTSS, refers to a variety of services and resources to assist people who experience a long-term disability to maintain their safety and comfort. The Revised Code of Washington, or RCW, refers to our statute. This is language that has been enacted by the legislature to create our laws. The laws provide program direction, limitations, and grant permission to state agencies for rulemaking. You've already heard me use the term Washington Cares Fund or WA Cares Fund. I tend to use them fairly interchangeably, but most likely going to default back to WA Cares Fund or WA Cares. You may also see this referenced as WCF. And last but certainly not least, the reason we are here today is for Washington Administrative Code, or WAC. These are rules developed by government agencies to implement policies and procedures as delegated by the legislature. You may also hear WACs referred to as regulations or rules. When I refer to rulemaking, it's regarding developing or amending this Washington Administrative Code, or WAC. So with that, we have gone through a brief, kind of setting the stage here, what to expect. I'm going to be turning it over to my partner here, Vicki Bouvier, to take us through a brief presentation.
Hello, everyone. I'm Vicki Bouvier, and as Ariel introduced me earlier, I am the WA Cares Fund Workforce Policy Manager. And I'll be going over doing a brief registration overview and just reminding folks of the information shared in the last two meetings, and then pressing on to talk about registration denials and deregistrations. Next slide, please.
And before we begin, Vicki, would you mind turning your camera on for us?
Oh, no problem, if it will. I don't know why my camera is not working. I assume. Well,
all right. Well, we'll continue on without camera, but thanks for trying.
Yeah. All right. So under RCW 50B.04.020 sub 3, the Department of Social and Health Services must register providers that meet minimum qualifications to provide care to beneficiaries under WA Cares. Next slide, please. Minimum qualifications to become a provider are established will be adopted in rule, and they are identified per the instruction in statute. They include having a valid license for the service that the provider wants to provide to beneficiaries, passing a criminal background check, having an active WACARES contract for services, and agreeing to the operational standards set by the program. Next slide, please. Operational standards will be adopted in rule, and on this slide, there are several examples of operational standards. I'll just quickly go through those. Holding liability insurance, cooperating with monitoring activities, using Provider One to submit pre-authorizations for beneficiary approval and for submitting claims for payment after services have been provided. Submitting payment claims must happen within 60 days of service. And then there are several notification requirements. The first one, of course, here is notifying the department if a beneficiary passes away or has a major incident during service provision. There's also a need to notify the department for changes in ownership, address changes, or if the provider no longer chooses to be registered as a WACARES provider, and if the provider no longer meets minimum qualifications. And as long-term services and sports providers will need to report suspected abuse, abandonment, neglect, or financial exploitation to adult protective services and law enforcement when applicable. Next slide, please. To become registered, there's a brief process. The provider would complete an application, including providing proof that they meet the minimum qualifications and providing documentation necessary to obtain a contract. Part of the process also includes completing a background check, and should there be prior criminal convictions that are not disqualifying, then one of the DSHS staff would complete a character competency and suitability review for that applicant. Part of the process includes obtaining a contract for a WACARES fund program. And then once all of that is done, the provider would be registered and listed on the Community Living Connection website, so beneficiaries can find providers and work with them to provide their care. Next slide, please. So the new piece of this conversation is registration denial or discontinuation. Next slide, please. So we'll just define what those are briefly. Denial, when we use denial, we mean a registration application that was not approved by DSHS for a provider to become registered. So things like not having a valid license or not passing a criminal background check. Discontinuation means that either DSHS or the provider ends their provider registration. Next slide, please. So under our statute 50B.04.020 sub 3, the department must discontinue the registration of providers that fail to meet minimum qualifications applicable in law or violate the operational standards of the program, which would be adopted in rule. Next slide, please. Reasons DSHS may deny or discontinue a registered provider registration. These are just some examples. The provider no longer meets minimum qualifications. Past contracts with DSHS were terminated for cause and were not able to issue another contract. Or the provider declines signing a contract or agreeing to the terms of a contract. Those would all be reasons to deny or discontinue a registration. Next slide, please. Providers can also choose to discontinue registration. And if that happens, the provider would just notify the department of their desire and when they want that to be effective, notify beneficiaries they're currently providing services to, and also maintain records covering the service timeframe. Next slide, please. Because registration is subject to Chapter 34.05 RCW, which is the Administrative Procedure Act, providers have an appeal right related to registration. So we are just beginning the work on this topic. So feedback on this process would be helpful today as well. Next slide, please. And I'll pass it off to Ariel. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Vicki, for giving us some foundation to work from when we transition over to our discussion. So I am opening up the chat right now. I'm also coming back on video. So we have the chat open. We will also have opportunities here for folks who would like to come off of mute. If you raise your hand, I will do my best to keep up with that and then allow you to come off of mute and share verbally. Please just be aware of the fact that we do have a number of people in the room here, and just want to make sure folks have time. We're not going too far off track here, so please just be aware of your time if you come off of mute. And try and shoot for around 2 minutes. You can always come back off of mute if needed. All right, I'm going to put our first question for you all up on the screen. And again, what we're here to do today is just to kind of have a discussion around what this could look like, what are some considerations, things we need to think about. So the first question we have to kick us off on that path is, what other actions could result in a denial or discontinuation of a registration? And again, a denial represents that an application to become a registered provider was denied. Discontinuation means either the Department of Social and Health Services or the provider chose to not continue a registration. So we're thinking about what that could look like, but very curious to hear from you all if you have experience, or things that should be considered when thinking about what actions could result in a denial or discontinuation of a registration. So while you're thinking about that, and feel free to kick us off in the chat at any time or raise your hand, I'm going to put some resources here in the chat in case you need to leave early and aren't going to see these towards the end when I share them again. There's a few resources I want to make sure folks have, and that is the DSHS website for rulemaking for the Walk Cares Fund program. We also have ESD's website for rulemaking and the Employment Security Department's website for rulemaking and the Healthcare Authority's website for rulemaking. You also have that WACARES at dshs.wa.gov email if you have program questions, as well as my email address if you have things you want to contribute, but you just don't have the opportunity to today. So those are all in the chat ready for you, but I'm curious to see what folks have to say about this question up on the screen. What other actions could result in a denial or discontinuation of a registration? And Carrie put in the chat here, for clarification, it sounds like registration means the application process that happens before the actual contracting process. Is that correct? Or does the term registration also mean the contracting process? I'm wondering if all this process happens at the DSHS level, or would the AAAs be doing this? Wonderful. That's a great question, Carrie. And some of this we are still kind of working through and mapping, but we do have the requirement in statute to register. And part of that that we have had to work through is that to be able to pay out to providers, we need a contract. And that's part of the client services requirements for DSHS, is that we have to have a contract for the payment portion. I believe at this point, we're thinking registration is the final step and the contracting would happen before that, knowing that the registration basically says you're good to work, but if we can't pay the providers, not really good to work yet. So thinking contracting would be done, and that would trigger the final registration. We do expect to be utilizing our partnerships with the area agencies on aging, and I think they will be taking a portion of supporting us in the contracting element. Some of that's still being worked through and discussed, but I do think there will be certainly a relationship there with the area agencies on aging. All right. And I see a question here. Can the website resources be made to copy and paste? Um, I'm wondering if it's not able to be pulled from the chat. Is that the clarification needed? And if so, I'm not too sure actually how to get it to you in a different way, but happy to share via email as well if needed. I see another question here. Can you please remind us of the link that contains disqualifying issues resulting from a background check? And I'm going to look to Vicki to support us with the link for disqualifying crimes for background checks. I think we're using a list that's currently being used by other parties. So I'll look to Vicki for some support on that one. If we can drop that in the chat, that would be helpful. But what else? What else here when we think about other actions could result in a denial or discontinuation of a registration? And we could throw contracting in there too. I know we have a few folks here on the call who are familiar with registration and how that works today. So maybe things that could revoke a contract, given that a contract is a requirement for the registration for payment. So I'll pause here and see what folks have to say about that. All right, thanks for the assist there, Vicki. Looks like we have a link there to Chapter 388-113 WAC, specifically 388-113-0020. So hopefully that link works for folks. And if you're ever having technical issues, or you're looking for, again, like the links that I've shared in the chat and you're not able to get them, please feel free to email me as well. I'm happy to share those once this is over. I want to make sure that you have the resources here. So just let me know if there's things I can be doing to assist there. Right, Amy said current Medicaid providers are subject to long wait times to be enrolled in Provider 1. Sometimes the providers give up before the process is complete. If registration involves a similar process, WellCare's provider might abandon the process as well. Not sure how this will work. Thanks for letting us know about that. That's good to hear. I do know we are very, very focused around efficiency and how to make sure we can get providers onboarded, ready to work in a very timely fashion. But it's good to know that folks are currently experiencing some wait times with Provider 1. So that's something for us to take note of. Thanks for bringing that up, Amy. All right, what else? All right. Well, we can still answer this question as we move forward, but I'm not seeing a lot. And so said, I'm still unclear about DSHS role versus the area agency on aging role. And that's certainly something we're still working through as well. And we should have some more information as we work through those those pieces of the pie here. But again, if you have program questions, whatnot, feel free to reach out to our customer care team, or reach out to me directly, and I'll see if I can route you to the right person. But again, a lot of this still being worked out as far as what it looks like within the process, because we're still building the process itself. So it's part of why we're here today, is to talk about what will the process look like, and that way we know where people need to be. All right, I'm going to move us on to the next question, but at any point in time, you can still answer this question. Um, let's see here. I'm hoping I didn't skip one. Okay, so what should be considered for timelines related to discontinued registrations? So again, the question is, what should be considered for timelines related to discontinued registrations? And again, discontinued registrations, we touched on, represents either the Department of Social and Health Services ending a registration with a provider, or a provider ending a registration on their own accord. So both things are considered here when we talk about discontinued registrations. All right, and I see a question here says, does DSHS object to debt, liens, or history of bankruptcy? And that's a great question. I'm curious to hear more as far as what should be considered about that. If there are things that we need to be taking into consideration one way or another, really curious to hear that. So if you wouldn't mind sharing, that would be great. All right, and Sarah's asking for clarification, which is wonderful. Thanks for asking for that. They're saying, do you mean a timeline before it is considered discontinued registration, or timeline for them to reapply after discontinued, or both? And it's both, really. Where does your mind go here? I'm purposely using kind of some open questions here to kind of see where our conversation goes. But it could be both. Really, when we're thinking about timelines and this topic, what kind of things need to be considered from a provider perspective, from the department perspective, from a beneficiary perspective who may be receiving services from a provider. We're open to really any of that when you think about what that looks like. So I'll open it wide there. Feel free to add whatever comes to mind when we think about timelines and discontinued registrations. And we did have a little bit of technical issues here with our chat. So Vicki had shared some links, but they don't seem to be going through. So I reshared them. So you have links here to that WAC 388-113-0020 for background checks, as well as the full chapter of background check rules, which is chapter 388-113 WAC. So just drop that in there. I hope that helps get the information you need for background checks. All right, so again, we have a question here up on the screen saying, what should be considered for timelines related to discontinued registrations? And it's a really broad question to go wherever you need it to go, but some ideas that I can think of as far as just timelines around how much notice should be provided in either direction, from the department to the provider, from the provider to the department, how much notice should be provided to the beneficiary who may be receiving services, how much time, let's see here, see if I can come up with any more scenarios. I think we had an assist here in the chat about like how long after registration is ended can somebody reapply. So I'll add that in there as well. So Cole said, if the application process mostly mirrors Medicaid, timeline expectations must also mirror. Cannot do the same work in less time. All right, that's great to hear. And it looks like we have a lot of agreement with that. So it's good to know. Um, so thanks for sharing that. What else? What else do we need to consider? Recognizing that we have this, if it's similar to Medicaid, should be the similar timeframes. But what else should be considered when we think about all the ways timelines come into play here with discontinued registrations? All right, and I see a question around DSHS's role in the registration process. Once again, we're still working through a lot of the details around that registration process and how our partners over at the Area Agency on Aging's can be involved in that process. So I can't say for sure right now one way or another, but I do think we're expecting some level of involvement from the Area Agency on Aging in the registration process. Maybe not for all providers, but we want to, recognize that the Area Agency on Aging is already involved in so much provider work in the Medicaid system and already has so many relationships built and familiar with their communities. So being able to kind of tap into that resource and expertise that the Area Agencies on Aging provide, I think is really helpful for the program as a whole. So that is something we're really considering as far as like how do we make sure we're utilizing the experts that are already out there doing this work to support the WA Cares Fund provider registration process. So where that starts and stops still to be determined, but I think that is certainly something we're considering. All right, and I see Sir Claire added that my feedback is DSHS should complete the registration process. Kyle added in here potential timeline, 30 days to review submitted application if application is incomplete, 30 days to provide missing information, an additional 30 days to review requested information. If information is still incomplete or not provided, maybe one more email to provide to provider, relaying their application is returned for withdrawal with list of what's missing, an opportunity to reapply within 3 months with the missing information. If reapplying within 3 months, then previously submitted documentation reviewed would still be valid unless an item is expired. Oh, wonderful. Thanks so much for all the detail with that, Kyle. That's really helpful in thinking through all those steps that go into getting something complete. I see a comment here that if reliance will be on technology to streamline and simplify to reduce timeline expectations, technology needs to work 100%. Yes. So deeply in my heart of hearts here, do I agree that technology needs to work? Easier said than done, but certainly a goal, and I appreciate hearing that. As far as the need of and making sure we're streamlined and meeting timelines. Looks like we have an agreement with Cole, and if much of this can be automated, that would help everyone. And then we have Medicaid Oakland application review timeline is up to 90 days. Again, any mirror of process must match timeline expectations. All right, and we have a question saying, am I correct in thinking most providers will try to get registered in the 2 years before WA Cares begins paying benefits? How soon will the application process open? And no, I don't think we're shooting for the 2 years. 2 years would be right about now, and we're still very much working on this. But we do hope to have that registration process open before, of course, before benefits become available. So we have providers ready for the beneficiaries. But beyond that, we're still working through so many of these details. So I'm very curious if you have feedback around that stuff, please feel free to share. Again, this is really our opportunity to gather some information from you and understand those things that we should be considering from different perspectives. All right, looks like Amy added regarding automation, please include potential providers and employees processing registration in the technology testing process. The best way to make sure technology works is to have real people use it and break it. This process should start early. That's great to hear, and certainly I think a really valuable insight here. So thanks for sharing that. And yeah, I think it's nice to find those holes before we have to rely on the technology to work. Having been on the other side of that many times, it's really frustrating. So thanks for sharing that. And hopefully we can get all of this tested and smooth. Um, so we'll see. All right. What else? I'll open this one up one more time before we move on. And that is what should be considered for timelines related to discontinued registrations. All right. Well, I'm going to move us on to our next question, but if you are typing, keep typing. We're not necessarily done with this one. I'm just going to let the next question um, kind of, start working, let you think about that next question. Our next question is, what else should be considered for provider requirements when discontinuing a registration? So we came up with a few examples or options earlier on, but really curious from your perspective, what else should be considered for provider requirements when discontinuing a registration? Or maybe you already have experience in contracts with providers. That would be really helpful to hear what requirements are considered, or should be considered or are considered today when discontinuing a contract. So something like that. So very open to hearing some feedback here. I'll let that sit and I'm going to come back to the chat. Again, if you want to unmute, you're welcome to raise your hand and I will come in and unmute you. So feel free to do that. I'll do my best to keep an eye on that. So Connie asked for clarification on what's considered discontinued. And a discontinued registration is when either the Department of Social and Health Services or the provider choose to end a registration that was already in effect. So it's already been approved. The provider has been registered, and either the provider is saying, hey, never mind, don't want to be registered anymore, or the department says, hey, you don't meet our registration requirements anymore, and that registration is discontinued. So there's kind of two different ways of looking at that, again, depending on who's initiating it. I hope that helps clarify what discontinued means here. All right, and I see there's a question here or a comment. I don't see anything that prevents a discontinued registry from curing their problem and re-registering. That is something we're looking at as far as, again, just kind of things we're thinking about, what needs to be considered with discontinued registration. We had that question about timelines and how, is there a certain waiting period before somebody can re-register or a provider can re-register? But there could be things that are just permanently disqualifying, I would imagine as well, such as a background check that, that can't be resolved. It's a disqualifying crime that likely will stay there and keep any future registration from happening. There could also be some history there, such as a terminated contract for cause, which means we can't contract again. And that limits the ability for payment. So there are some things that I can think of that may prevent a person or a provider who's been registered, who's no longer registered, and who would no longer be able to become registered. But there are, certainly something we're still working through as far as, again, if somebody chose to discontinue registration, is there a waiting period to re-register, stuff like that. We're still working through, but very open to hearing ideas. All right, and the question we have up right now is what else should be considered for provider requirements when discontinuing a registration? All right, we have some questions here. Will there be a mechanism to seek feedback on providers from clients? If there is consistent poor feedback, how will that be addressed? Who will address it? Could it result in discontinuation? And those are all wonderful questions, Amy. I'm curious if you have any recommendations or suggestions for answers to those questions. Again, we're still in the very early stages of a lot of this work and still considering that. So very curious if you have either experience or feedback on what should be considered there. All right. What else here? What else should be considered for provider requirements when discontinuing a registration? Curious if we have any thoughts on this one here. All right. Well, if you're typing, keep typing. I'm moving us along though. And let's see here. Our last question for today is a really broad one. And this is just an opportunity to kind of put some ideas out there by you all. If there's something that comes to mind with this question, we purposely left this broad. So the question is there anything else that should be considered regarding registration, denial of a registration, or discontinuing a registration? So this is kind of that broad open question, open-ended question, seeing where folks want to go with this. Again, when we're talking about this, I just want to recenter us that we are talking about rulemaking. There's a lot of things that are going to fall outside of rulemaking for consideration, but we're really focused today on rulemaking and how that, what needs to be in rule. But, we're here to hear things, so please feel free to share what comes to mind when you see this question up on the screen. I'm going to turn back to the chat. And again, feel free to answer any question we've covered so far today. If you are having a thought about something we've already discussed, throw it in the chat. That's okay. Or raise your hand and I will unmute you. All right. So I see Amy added here that I think this is moving into the realm of monitoring, maybe not directly on topic today, but something we'll need more information on as this planning process unfolds. I do think there should be a way for clients to give feedback. Wonderful. Thanks so much for adding that, Amy. And certainly I think there will be some layer of monitoring somewhere. So much more to come on that. But again, if you have ideas on what would work or what does not work or any of those things, very happy to hear what kind of what again comes to mind when you think about these things. Cole added a wait time to reapply. Medicaid is 6 months between applications. Okay, wonderful. So 6 months between the time in which you're no longer, in our case, registered, to wait 6 months and then you can come back. So that's good to know, and certainly a good standard for us to look to for a comparison. So thank you. What else? Again, we have a question up here. Is there anything else that should be considered regarding registration, denial of a registration, or discontinuing a registration? We do have quite a few people in the room here today, so I am very curious to hear from you. I imagine if you're here today, it's likely because you have some level of experience or association with registration. So very curious to hear your thoughts and what should be considered as we start drafting rules for this topic. Certainly would really appreciate hearing them so we can have those discussions early on and get that into um, our plan. So let me know. All All right, Lynn asked, will there be an appeal process for discontinuations? And we do expect any determination by the Department of Social and Health Services will have an appeal right, one of which would be if a provider registration is discontinued, there would be appeal rights there. We are very, very early on in that discussion at this point, so I don't have too much more to share. But we do expect that we will be doing some rulemaking around that topic at some point. So more to come on that as we work through and kind of get into more details. But curious if an appeal process makes any, impacts this in any way, or if you're thinking about, um, anything regarding appeals for this topic. Again, we're so much more to come on that topic, but happy to hear. All right, Kyle says that applicants have access to plain language instructions, application registration expectations, and timelines. To minimize application errors, one document for open-ended questions with space to write answers and separate document with a checklist of what needs to be submitted. We've noticed some of our Medicaid applications miss seeing required documents and don't always have space to respond to open-ended questions. That's great to hear. Thanks for that kind of real life uh, experience there. Um, I see here Sarah saying, in addition, will anything be translated? And I'm hoping you could clarify that a little bit. When we talk about anything, what are we talking about? I know it's really broad, so I'm not sure if that's intentional, but curious if you could drill down that a little bit. Oh, and the registration process. Wonderful. Well, I think that we certainly want access there, but I'm curious to hear from experience, like what that translation, has looked like so far for folks. I know that that's a big value for us, is making sure we have easy access for folks where English is not their primary language. So curious if you could, if you have any experience you could share there that will help us navigate that, be really helpful. All right. What else? Hoping we can have just a little bit more on this question. Um, Very curious to hear, but I'll give it just a little bit longer and then we'll move on. And Nicole said unprecedented for contracting providers in Medicaid, and Older Americans Act, or Family Caregiver Support Program. And Nicole, can you clarify what is unprecedented, just so I connect that to the right comment? Okay. So I see mandated translation and interpreter services are unprecedented for contracting providers in those programs. Okay, wonderful. Thanks for clarifying. That's good to hear. As far as just where we are today, hopefully we can find some better access there, though, as we move forward. Kyle said having an example contract that can be shared with applicants. All right. All right. And Sarah clarified for, I don't believe it should be mandatory, but was curious if DSHS would provide translated materials for providers about the process. Wonderful. All right. Thanks for clarifying that. Well, it seems like we are going pretty slow here on this question. So I'm going to move along here, but if you're typing, keep typing. Certainly have just a second here. I'm going to just start closing us up though. I shared these in the chat earlier. I'm going to share them once more. We have 3 different websites for you to review at your leisure. The first one being the DSHS Washington Cares Fund rulemaking site. That is where you'll be able to find recordings of these sessions. You'll be able to find the slide decks. There'll be information about future rulemaking listed there as we file 102s or future 101s. You'll be able to find it there. The Employment Security Department has a rulemaking website as well. They are also doing rulemaking. So if you're interested in their portion of the WCARES or Washington Cares Fund program, go seek them out. They will have some great work being done on their site as well. The Healthcare Authority will also be doing rulemaking. They expect to start that in 2025, but they also share a portion of the Washington Cares Fund program and will be doing rulemaking here in the future. Once again, we have the WildCares at dshs.wa.gov email if you have program-related questions. If you have questions about rulemaking or you want to share some stuff that you didn't share in this meeting, you can email me, and the email is here in the chat. It's my first name, Ariel, my last name, Finney, 2@dshs.wa.gov. We have a few comments here in the chat I'm going to catch up on. Connie said we understand interpreter must be provided. Will DSHS be covering the costs? And Nicole is agreeing with Sarah. A consideration would be how would client engage with a provider who requires translation or interpretation? And how would contract monitoring work? Would requirement carry through to ongoing contract management? Wonderful. All right, well, all good questions, things to be considered, so much of which we're still working through. But if you have any ideas on how to tackle these problems, please feel free to share. Always happy to hear. So once again, thank you for being here. Really happy that we had this opportunity to chat today and work through some of our questions. Our next meeting and our final meeting of this current series is going to be July 17th at 2 p.m. We're going to be wrapping up this whole series and trying to kind of finalize our topics here. So until then, have a wonderful day. Thanks for being here. Thanks for participating. And I look forward to doing it again. Take care all.